Breeding farms or slave breeding in the United States refers to the practice in which enslaved African Americans were coerced into having children with the aim of increasing the slave population. This practice was part of the broader and inhumane system of slavery in the United States, particularly in the 19th century. The primary motivation behind slave breeding was economic. Enslaved people were considered property, and their children automatically became the property of the slave owner. By increasing the number of enslaved people through reproduction, slave owners aimed to increase their labor force and thus their wealth. Enslaved men and women had no legal rights over their bodies or their children. They were often forced into sexual relations without consent. Families could be separated at any time through sale or trade, adding to the trauma and inhumanity of the system. This practice had a profound psychological and physical impact on those who were subjected to it. The violation of personal autonomy and the pain of family separations were among the many cruelties of slavery. While slave breeding occurred in various parts of the South, its prevalence varied by region and time period. It became more common especially after the United States banned the importation of slaves in 1808, which increased the internal demand for slaves. There is some historical debate about the extent and systematic nature of slave breeding. While it's clear that forced reproduction and sexual exploitation were widespread, the degree to which this was organized as a formal breeding practice is a subject of ongoing research and discussion among historians. The end of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery with the 13th Amendment in 1865 put an end to these practices. However, the legacy of such exploitation has had lasting effects on African American communities. The concept of slave breeding is a stark reminder of the many atrocities and human rights violations inherent in the system of slavery. It underscores the dehumanizing aspects of treating people as property and the long-lasting impacts of such practices on individuals, families, and communities. The historical documentation of specific breeding farms or locations explicitly dedicated to the breeding of enslaved people in America is limited and somewhat controversial among historians. The practice of forced breeding and sexual exploitation of enslaved people is well documented, but the existence of farms solely or primarily for this purpose is less clear and often debated. This ambiguity is partly due to the secretive nature of such practices and the lack of comprehensive records. In the antebellum South, the economic incentive to increase the enslaved population was significant, especially after the United States banned the international slave trade in 1808. This ban increased the internal trade of enslaved people within the country, including the sale of children born into slavery. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women and the expectation that they produced children was common on many plantations and farms. This practice was driven by the desire of slave owners to increase their labor force and was an integral part of the brutality of slavery. Historical records often do not specify particular farms or plantations as breeding centers. Instead, the increase in the enslaved population was a more widespread phenomenon across the slave-holding states. Some of the understanding of these practices comes from oral histories, narratives of formerly enslaved people, and the accounts of abolitionists. These sources often describe the forced sexual exploitation and its consequences but do not typically identify specific locations as breeding farms. The dynamics of slavery and the treatment of enslaved people varied across different regions and states. While some areas might have been more notorious for harsh treatment, including the exploitation of reproductive labor, the practice was not confined to any single geographic location. I believe the impact of these practices stems from the over-sexualization of African American women in contemporary society.